All right, this is David Rice from Hit Christian. I have a Substack. I also have a Rumble channel, YouTube channel. You can find me on Missouri Liberty Radio in Owensville. You can find me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm here today with Terry R. Hyten. He wrote a book, Ukraine Meets American Empire. He is a lawyer. He's litigated since 1956.
1982.
1982.
I was born in 1956.
1956, sorry.
I mean, my mom would argue that I maybe litigated when I was born, but yeah.
Okay. You are also, you said you were elected to a position as a...
I was a trustee of a village in Prairie
Trustee.
Grove, Illinois, yeah.
Okay, trustee of the village. All right, so you're semi-retired, you moved to Missouri,
Yes.
and you wrote this book because you are concerned about what's going on in Ukraine, and you feel like the information that the media has been presenting isn't accurate.
Yeah, it's pretty inaccurate. In fact, I would maybe classify it as misinformation or propaganda. You know, there's propaganda in every war
Yeah,
that breaks out. But,
I think you covered that pretty well. You talk about the propaganda that was in the Vietnam War,
right.
and how most of the information we had was didn't cover the details of the war and hid it until there was an incident where the Vietnam Papers, is that what it was
The
called?
Pentagon Papers
Pentagon
by
Papers.
Daniel Ellsberg, you know, actually the New York Times. And it was, I grew up in that era, so I mean, it was imprinted on me, you know, how important that was. That was quite a revelation. I mean, he had a large fight to get that truth out, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And so he went to the New York Times with that story, and it kind of changed the whole narrative of the war after that.
Yeah, it helped, you know, switch the war around in terms of American people turned against the war, Vietnam War, for a number of reasons, but that was definitely contributing. Yeah.
And what we need in America right now is people willing to tell the truth about. And this conflict in Ukraine started when?
Well, if you look at the historical part of Ukraine, I mean, it's always been a country that's been a little bit, it really technically has been a country that we would define as a country, except for the last 31 years. Okay.
Yeah.
But the real war between Ukraine and Russia broke out in 2014. You know, Russia went into Crimea. They argued that they had to go into Crimea to protect their citizens. They also have the largest naval base that they've had since 1776 on the Black Sea. They're not going to give that up, by the way. I mean, they'll go to World War III before they give that up. So that's why they went into Crimea. You can argue one way or the other. You know, we went into Ukraine and started supporting them to counter Russia at that point in time. The Russians are going to say on the other side that, no, we're just reacting in response to what you've already done. So, I mean, that dynamic is there in Ukraine. It's been there for a long time.
So you have this long-term conflict that's been going on in Ukraine because you have a people group that is aligned more with Russia, the East, and then you have another part of Ukraine is aligned with the West. They want to be more Germanic or more just Western.
They want to go more Western. I mean, they've always leaned West. They leaned West during World War II. I mean, when Putin says that he wants to denazify Ukraine, I mean, there's a kernel of truth there that, you know, we don't want to recognize. You know, and in fact, our involvement in Ukraine from an American standpoint actually goes back to the Cold War in the 1940s when the CIA, you know, went into Ukraine and used them to try to infiltrate into the old Soviet Empire. So we go back quite a long way in terms of our involvement in Ukraine. I mean, the history is pretty fascinating.
So we haven't just shown up in Ukraine in the last 3 years, and we've had boots on the ground, would you say?
We have boots on the ground. They won't come out and say that. We've had, in fact, I think the New York Times came out this year in February and disclosed that the CIA had 12 secret military bases on the border between Ukraine and Russia, and they've been operating for a long time there, at least since 2014. So we have had trainers and boots on the ground. We also primarily have armed them. They had the second largest standing army in Europe next to Turkey, and we helped build that up as a counter to what we considered Russian influence on their borders.
So they have this really large army. We've been interfering with them since the beginning of the Cold War, since the early 1950s. Why, after 1991, when the wall falls, the West has won, Russia's pretty much in turmoil, their economy has completely collapsed.
Correct.
Why do we even care after that point?
Well, that gets to the heart of, why we're there. I mean, what I personally believe is that um, America really wants to control large portions of the world for economic reasons. I mean, Ukraine is filled full of vast resources. I saw something on YouTube the other day mentioning trillions of dollars in resources. Well, it has some of the most fertile ground in the world. It was known as Russia's breadbasket for a long period of time, and if you control that, you economically speaking, that's worth a lot of attention by the West.
You can starve out a lot of people by not letting Ukraine grow food.
Correct. Yes.
And so, if they're trying to starve people out, are they trying to starve the Ukrainians out by having this war, or are
I
they
don't think we're
starve?
trying to starve them out. I think the Russians and the Ukrainians cut a deal to let them export grain for a long period of time. If you want to get to what each side claims they want to achieve, okay, and why we're at war here, or why the Russians and the Ukrainians are at war here, I think you have to look at the fact that from the Russian point of view, they don't want Ukraine to become part of NATO. Now, NATO's been expanding since 1991 when the Iron Curtain collapsed. We've been expanding in their direction. Okay.
You said that NATO started with how many nations?
Yeah, it started with, I think, 11 or 12 nations. It's now up to, 31, 32, somewhere in that. It's in the book. It has a count. It's doubled, if not tripled in size. I mean, and that's actually contributed to our military because, NATO has an Article 5, which means that we have to come to the aid of military of anybody who is attacked. The interesting point that I see is that Ukraine is not part of NATO. So that's one question mark. Why are we so involved in a non-NATO nation, supporting them?
We're acting like they are de facto.
They are
a NATO nation,
and there definitely are a de facto nation. In fact, I devoted a chapter to the fact that they are a de facto nation.
Yeah.
NATO nation.
Yeah, and you describe all the aid that we're giving them, all the military aid. We're certainly giving them so many tanks. When I was researching this book and I was looking at some of the things, I did sort of a deep rabbit hole, and I was looking at some of the tanks that Russia's captured and put on display of our M1 Abrams.
Right.
Some of our best technology that we're giving to Ukraine we're paying for, that Russia has used as captured, destroyed material. Some of our Bradleys,
Right.
How many of our planes are we about ready to send over?
And now we're going to send over F-16s, which is it's another. I mean, Russia has these red lines, and we want to continue to escalate toward those red lines. And unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is referenced in the book, there is no attempt to come to the bargaining table or the negotiating table and de-escalate here. We're sending nothing but signals of escalation to the Russians.
Yeah.
And that's not a healthy thing for us or for the world.
No, I mean, if we want to tell the Russians, let's meet at the negotiating table, let's find a solution to this problem, all we're going to end up doing at the end of the day is pushing them into the arms of other nations. And you talk about that in the book. We have pushed them into China's arms,
right.
Africa's arms.
Now North Korea.
They just signed a
defense pact, where they're going to come to the aid of North Korea in case there's a war that breaks out between North Korea and South Korea. So, we're militarizing the world right now, which amounts what it amounts to. And, it's a very dangerous situation. In my humble opinion, we're closer to World War III than we've ever been.
Yeah.
Especially since 1962, the last Cuban Missile Crisis.
What do we benefit by creating this crisis?
Well, there's an old phrase: "Don't let any crisis go
to waste." Yeah.
to waste." There may be an elite that think they can gain advantage. I'm convinced that there's a certain portion of our country, the neocons are some of the elites that run the country and make the decisions behind the curtain, as they say.
Yeah.
Think that we can win a war with Russia. They think that Russia needs to be dethroned and controlled by the West, and I think that power struggle is going on right now.
Why did they hate Russia so much?
It's a great question. I think some of it does go back to the Cold War. There's an old Cold War mentality that comes from the Cold War that still looks at Russia as the boogeyman. Of course, there's an argument to be made that you need a boogeyman to justify military expenditures and the industrial military complex that Eisenhower warned us about. There is probably some truth in that. And I think America just likes to be the top dog. I mean, that's why, the American hegemony is important to certain segments of our leadership in the world.
Is it just about the idea of it? They're so obsessed with the idea of the hegemony that they're willing to do anything to maintain it?
I think that if you get down into of maybe just following the money type of thought process, the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Yeah.
But that's backed up by America being the largest military power in the world. If we didn't have the petrodollar and the dollar in that playing that position, we wouldn't be able to project military power. But it works the other way around too. I mean, without the dollar, we can't project.
And you talk about the sanctions that we're doing, and you also talk about BRIC. So let's run through sanctions and then run through BRIC.
Sure.
So the sanctions that we're putting against Russia, you said, are some of the worst sanctions that have ever been done against a nation in history.
Well, except for maybe Cuba and maybe Iran. I mean,
okay.
we I was not aware of this, but we sanction countries without a drop of a hat. I mean, to borrow an expression, we use them, and we use them rather effectively, to be honest with you. And we've sanctioned Russia like 300. We got 300 sanctions currently going against Russia. If you want to look at it, we're already at total economic war with Russia. I mean, I'm talking about the United States is at total economic war with Russia. Russia has anticipated that in advance, and they've de-dollarized. Okay, they don't have to trade, for their products overseas, internationally, and their exports. They don't have to go to the dollar first to become part of the petrodollar system. That's what the BRICS is all about. Now we're helping to create the BRICS by our own policy blunders, in my opinion. Okay, but I think that large dynamic is behind the scenes, a driving factor in all this decision. I think these are large forces in the world clashing, okay? And this is what leads to world wars.
Yeah.
And that's why I consider it so dangerous. Kennedy, to his credit, back in 1962, de-escalated this. I mean, in 13 days, him and Khrushchev sat down and de-escalated the process. None of that is going on now. And in fact, we basically have prohibited the Ukrainians from negotiating peace.
And I want to talk about BRIC, but is there any communication between the U.S. government and the Russian government?
There may be back communication.
Channels?
But we obviously wouldn't be aware of it anyway, and if it is, it's not leaking out anywhere. But there's no overt sign of it happening anywhere. I mean, the only sign we hear is we're going to continue to escalate this because what Stoltenberg, I think her name was, out of the European Union, said NATO must win this war. I mean, that's the mantra from the West.
So Russia had $350 billion in assets, and they're going to take that $350 billion and do reparations with it. And
where they're thinking about that. But what they decided to do initially, I mean, to me, it's like a test balloon. Okay, how are the Russians going to react to this? So another escalation, by the way.
Yeah.
We're gonna take the interest that $350 billion is generated, and we're going to take that and we're going to give it to the Ukrainians. We're going to see how the Russians react to that, and depending on how they react to it, we'll just seize all their assets.
Well,
that's never happened before internationally, by the way.
Yeah, while they're also giving them missiles to send into Russian territory
Correct.
for the first time.
Yeah, another escalation.
Yeah, so it's all escalation.
Correct.
It's like what they're trying to push Putin into acting in a nuclear fashion.
They want him to make the first jump so they can accuse Russia of initiating the war. That's a tactic we used before. If American people aren't aware of it. Now we can go there if you want to.
But this doesn't lead.
It's a rabbit trail. Okay.
Yeah, but this doesn't lead to anywhere good for anyone.
No, correct.
Unless you want to live your life out in a bunker. So
correct. Yes. Yeah. And hopefully, cooler heads will prevail.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I was reading it, it almost sounded like what they're doing with the money situation with sanctions is siege warfare. So you would surround a city and you would put your trebuchets up and your catapults and you would throw things into the city and kind of starve them out.
Correct.
And we have been using economic policy as siege warfare and surrounding a country and totally cutting them off. Correct. And trying to starve out their population.
No. That's been very effective in the past. If you think about it, we still have an embargo against Cuba.
Yeah.
And Cuba is like a crap hole, excuse the French.
It is, yeah.
In the Caribbean, and they've never really recovered from our sanctions, which are still in place, by the way, largely. Iran's another country that has suffered under United States sanctions. Now, you can say sometimes sanctions against countries are good because they prohibit bad actors from doing bad things in the world. So I'm not saying that sometimes our sanctions aren't necessary, okay? But you have to understand that sanctions are, number one, an escalation. Number two, in situations like Ukraine, are totally uncalled for. Okay?
Yeah. What would Cuba look like if we had American tourism in Cuba all these decades?
Now, I say this in jest, but what would happen to Cuba if we just let the mob run it like they did? It was the most profitable in that island in the Caribbean for a long time.
Yeah, it might be a different place. So let's get to the BRIC.
Sure.
So what does BRIC stand for?
That's the. It's an acronym for something. I forget.
Sorry, I can look it up.
That's okay.
You have a really good index, but it's an alternative currency.
Well, generally speaking, it's what it is. It's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That's what it stands for now.
Okay.
Senior moment. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
And Saudi Arabia is now joined. Okay, which is interesting.
Is it BRICS?
Yeah, it's
That's
BRICS.
a joke.
BRICS in South Africa, by the way. Those are the original five. They banded together, and they banded together basically to trade in their own currencies without using the U.S. dollar, because the way the world system's set up right now, you have to have dollars as a reserve currency to trade in, so you can buy the product of the other country first in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
That's the way it works. Now, that's the Russians understand that America uses that. They've weaponized the dollar. And we control the world that way in a literal sense, to be honest with you. And the Russians and the Chinese don't like that. And the rest of the world is beginning not to like it either.
Yeah, and
because we're not a neutral arbiter anymore.
Why does Saudi Arabia want to join with Russia and China? Because Saudi Arabia should be an ally, but someone said something to the Saudi Arabian princes.
Well, again, it all goes back, I think, to economics. The Chinese have an interesting. They're a direct competitors to the United States. Okay, there's no doubt about it. They have a multi-trillion-dollar Silk Road initiative.
Yeah.
Okay, that they want to trade, and they want to create a large trading bloc that counters the United States, not only in Asia,
but South America,
but Europe,
yeah,
and Africa. I mean, and they think that they control that economically, that they can outdo the United States and become basically their own hegemony.
Yeah.
Now that's part of behind the scenes what's going on in this war. I mean, the interesting thing that I mentioned just briefly in the book that probably should be brought out is that Russia and China are not natural allies. This war has contributed to pushing them together.
Yeah.
Russia is more Western than China is. Okay, so there was a period of time when actually Russia wanted to join NATO, and we basically said no. And that was under the Clinton administration. I found that quite fascinating because I didn't know that before I did the research.
And then Hillary Clinton, as the head of the State Department, did to make relationships with Russia better when she was in the Obama administration.
Right.
And so that was the 2014 problems?
Yeah, it was around then. I think some of this goes back to Bill Clinton. I think Putin approached and said, hey, we'll join NATO because Russia was militarily weak after the Iron Curtain fell.
Yeah.
Russia was military weak. They couldn't have even probably invaded Ukraine back then. Okay, and I think what we got out of the Iron Curtain falling is the fact that we won the Cold War. Okay, Russia didn't look at it like that. Russia looked like, hey, we're giving in. We don't want. We'll withdraw from all these satellite nations. We're in the Warsaw Pact countries. We don't want to do that anymore. We understand that that's just
doesn't work for us.
It doesn't work for us. Okay, you really can't control that many countries anyway. So we're withdrawing. We want peace. We want to trade. We want to increase the standard of living. We're giving up communism. There was a total ideological mind shift in the mind of Russia back in 1991 that happened all the way through the 90s. It was a perfect time to sit down with them and negotiate some long-lasting peace. And the only thing the Russians wanted is the Warsaw Pact countries, okay, that the Soviet Union controlled. They wanted those all to be neutral. Don't bring them into NATO. When we started bringing the former Warsaw Pact nations into NATO, Russia started getting the mixed messages about how interested are you of really, trading as equal partners with us. And then the Ukraine war kind of tore it with the Russians, saying, now we understand. I think you basically you want to control us. Yeah, and that's what they're getting out of all this.
It'd be basically like China going to Mexico and saying, hey, would you like to join us in our non-aggression pact? And saying, you would be we'll put military bases and on your borders with America. And then they go to Canada and say the same thing. And America's supposed to just be like, yeah, that's okay.
Right, yeah. Well, not only if you think about it from the Russian point of view, let's just, Ukraine's the primary example.
Yeah.
Ukraine goes into flips west entirely. Well, they're going to be oriented toward the west in terms of all their trade. Well, all that trade they used to do with Russia, Russia becomes poor.
And Ukraine's not a small country.
It's not.
It's a fairly, what's about the size of Texas?
It is large. It's a large country.
Yeah.
It's a large country. And at one point in time, it had, I think, 40 million people in it. Now that population has been
decimated.
Yes.
Yeah, through refugees or through war. And they're taking their young men and they're scooping them off the street. Their old men, they're scooping them off the street. People aren't seeing their kids. There's talk about organ harvesting going on. There's just horrible
bioweapon labs run out of Ukraine probably.
That we are running.
That we have contributed to. That's another rabbit hole. But, there's all sorts of large issues there that the American people should probably become aware of.
Yeah, we are doing some of the worst crimes under the cover of war, under the shadow of war, and no one's going to be able to investigate for decades, if ever. And we are partnering with a paramilitary Nazi organization. And
the other point in the book that I wanted to make pretty clear was that Ukraine, any way you define it, Ukraine is not a democracy.
No.
Okay. First of all, President Zelensky, he's his term of election was up in May.
Yeah.
And he's basically shut it down. So he actually is acting as an authoritarian dictator almost now, saying, look, there's no elections, there's no free elections. There's no really freedom of the press right now. They've shut down a large segment of the Russian Orthodox Church. My book addresses that.
Yeah.
You got to understand that there is a partial justification for that because the Russian Orthodox Church actually supports Russia.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
But no
again,
freedom of religion.
no freedom of religion in a sense. I mean, you can't. He shut down everything.
Yeah.
Most Americans wouldn't consider that freedom. Okay?
Well, we have a history of not creating democracies in other nations, but creating authoritarian regimes.
Right.
I mean, we are the ones responsible for setting up Saddam Hussein. We are the ones who created the Shah.
Correct.
And
yes.
then
Prime,
we get
great example.
Yeah, and we get Iran with the Ayatollahs,
right.
because there's such a pushback over being controlled by an American Shah, and so people are unaware that we have created a lot of the problems we are now trying to control.
Right.
And so,
well, one of the reasons I wrote the book was I just, hey, look, where is the leadership in this country in terms of don't we want at some point in time to come to the negotiating table of the Russians? This recent fiasco, in my opinion, in Switzerland, where we had basically said they had 100 nations show up at a peace conference, quote unquote, but they didn't invite the Russians. So how are you going to negotiate? Basically, it's a dictating terms to Russia about, hey, here's what we require you to do.
And we shut the Russians out of the UN.
Right.
What's going to happen is we'll have an alternate UN formed by these other countries.
Eventually, that might be what happens. I can tell you one of the things that looks like it's going to happen because of the Ukrainian war is NATO is going to cease to exist in its current form. Europe's going to have to make the decision that it probably has interests that are contrary to American interests in the world, and they're going to have to assert themselves, which they should have done in this war. They should have said, no, look, we're for negotiating this. I mean, Russia's a lot closer to us than you are, especially Germany had a great reason for sitting down and forcing negotiations to occur and forcing a settlement.
With the elections in Germany, how much of that played into what's been going on? The elections in France, how much of that played into? We hurt their economy with this war.
Correct.
And both of their economies. And I think people, they vote by their pocketbook. They always vote by their pocketbook. So
these are large geopolitical forces colliding. And I mean, this is what generates world wars, and this is what we have to try to steer out of. And I don't see anything in the current mindset. Now, I don't want to give away what party I vote for, but on the Republican side and the Democrat side, I mean, there's a lot of support for this war on both sides.
Yeah, and
Lindsey Graham being the primary Republican, that he doesn't see anything wrong with going to flat out war with Russia. I mean, I would beg to differ with him. I don't want to see nukes over my head. Right? But this guy doesn't seem to see that's about it. He thinks that Russia is like a paper tiger. Let's test it. Let's see how.
Does he think we have enough Patriot missiles that could take down enough of their?
I don't think Lindsey Graham has
enough common sense on this issue.
I don't think Lindsey Graham. We talked about this a bit. I think Lindsey Graham is probably controlled by lobbyists and by people who contribute to his campaign, which is probably people in the defense industry.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of money there's just so much money being made by having war.
Correct.
And there's so much money to be made by escalating this to the point where there's guns and bullets and tanks and planes and missiles being shipped off and used and expended, and it doesn't matter how many lives are cost for the Ukrainians or how many American lives are eventually will be spent to do this, because that's just money to be earned. So that's what we're all reduced to eventually.
Right.
So where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's on Ingram.
Ingram Spark.
Yeah,
okay.
The publisher.
How long has it been out?
It's been out since I think the last couple of weeks in April.
Okay.
So I guess that's relatively recent. It's my first book. I wrote because I have a passion for trying to address issues. As a lawyer, you learn how to do great research.
Yeah.
Early on,
I like my interviews with lawyers.
Early on, you just learn, hey, look, let's try to get to the bottom of things. Let's look at facts, see where the facts take you. And early on, I was picking up, and it wasn't hard to do if you just Googled enough of news overseas. I mean, the narrative overseas is completely different than the narrative in America.
Yeah, I like going to the Hindustan Times.
Times is
Yeah.
more neutral,
Which is weird. Yeah, but I find that it's frustrating to get straight news here in the U.S., which is part of the reason I have my channel, because I get in trouble all the time because I try to tell straight news, and I'm actually being censored right now.
Really?
Before, and I've been asked not to contribute any more stories to certain places because of my too honest opinion. So, because I won't support the political party.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's just me, the baby bird getting out of the nest kind of thing.
Sure.
So I think everybody should pick up this book. It's a great read. It's well researched. He's got great endnotes. He's got almost as much endnotes as he's got book.
I did that on purpose, by the way, because I knew I'd get a lot of
questions.
This is not what I'm hearing from Fox or CNN, or MSNBC or any American network. Why not? Why is your story? Why is your facts, as you call them, so different than what we're hearing in the American public? Well, I mean, first of all, get a clue. I mean, we were misled during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for governments to mislead their population,
and for the media
during warfare.
And the media jump on board, and I think the media has completely jumped on board. And I mean, this is partly the reason why Tucker Carlson was fired. I mean, just because he was digging at the truth, and we all have to dig at the truth. So go ahead and go to Amazon, pick up this book, Ukraine Meets American Empire by Terry Hyten. On the title or the page of the book would be Terrence R. Hyten. So I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for the interview.
Very welcome. Hey, for $17 you can barely go to McDonald's. Go out and invest, okay? Get
it's a great investment. Thank you very much.
All right.